Can everyone hear me? I paid him to say that, so. All right, so it's really early in the morning, except if you're an East Coast person like me, it's like lunchtime. So I'm feeling really good. I've been eating like both meals, like breakfast and lunch, which has been really good. Someone told me not to put that joke in there, and I see why now, because that clearly did not work. All right, so today I want to talk about your apps and how your users perceive them and what you can do about it. The title of the talk is called Storming the Castle. Why do your users hate you, and what can you do about it? The alternate title I considered was App Store Reviews, This is Why I Drink. Just a quick show of hands, how many people have an app in the App Store? Another show of hands, how many people have a consumer app? Oh, a lot, that's good. And then how many people have just B2B, I suppose? All right, so a lot of people understand that consumers sometimes can be a little fickle. So you might be wondering, who is this person? My name is Shaun Lewis, and I'm an engineering manager at O'Reilly Media. We make the line art books, and I am from Akron, Ohio, and I enjoy tacos. That's very important. The other thing that you should know about me is that I am very nervous right now, and I'm going to try to get through this as best I can. But if you'll bear with me, I think that we can have some fun along the way. And hopefully there'll be some interesting slides in this deck. So first off, our agenda. I want to talk to you a little bit about O'Reilly Media, specifically a problem we had with App Store ratings whenever we launched one of our apps called Q. This was a cross-platform app, separate code bases, Android and iOS, but it was a very consistent problem that we had low App Store ratings. So it is specific to O'Reilly, but I think there are some just commonalities that all apps share, and there are some pain points that we experience that I think are relevant for everyone. So we attempted to solve our App Store rating problem, and so I want to talk about where that solution led us and the problems we faced whenever we actually attempted to solve that problem. And then finally, I want to talk about what we learned about our users. So we approached the problem simply, but I think there were some fundamental things that changed how we approach product development and engineering at the company. So at its core, this is a journey specific to my team. It is a journey the team went through. Some of you may have different experiences, but like I said before, there are a lot of commonalities I think we can share. So without further ado, have fun storming the castle. So the problem. This is a major problem. We have an app in the App Store, and the problem is that users can write reviews. That's a good thing, possibly. Users can have a material impact on your sales, and they can affect your perception in the marketplace. So users can be your champion. That's also a negative thing, because users can materially affect sales, and they can have an effect on your perception in the marketplace. They can also be your opponents, which is the danger. So we had a problem when we shipped our app. The problem was that users just didn't quite exactly want what we shipped them. So we also had another problem. We didn't know really how to respond to user feedback. There was just a gap that was happening. It was missing, and we would have our happy user who would typically download the app, and they would sometimes become a frustrated user, and then their course of action for venting their frustration was a negative review, and then we would respond to that review and hopefully fix the problem. Sometimes we fixed the problem, sometimes we made the problem worse, and sometimes we had very little effect on the problem at all. We tried our hardest, but there was just something missing in that process. So the first thing to note is that it's a very reactive process. It was happening after the review. So we needed to find a way to decrease the amount of negative reviews in the App Store because it was affecting customers' perception of us. So that's basically how we approached this, was we wanted to increase our App Store rating. So how do we solve it? Well, we first took a look at all the reviews that were in the store. And there were a lot of them, and they distilled down to a number of, core components and shared bits of just of content within the reviews. So the first one was actually related to content. So we're a publishing company. The app was an app where you consume content. Some of you might even have it and use it. Don't give me bug reports if you do, I'm sorry. But we have a problem with content in the app sometimes, where content is styled incorrectly, or it's sometimes the wrong content, and users would get frustrated about that, understandably. Another problem that users would typically find were bugs. How many of you have a bug in your app right now that you know of that's still shipping? Okay, yeah, great. So mistakes happen. Unfortunately for the users, that typically resulted in somebody saying this app sucks and that the developer should be fired or die penniless in the streets. Which, by the way, if we were ever taken to task on that, our industry would collapse, unfortunately. So bugs were a problem and continue to be a problem for all apps. Another thing that we found in the reviews contained were very specific features. So, for example, I want the app to pause video when the International Space Station is in the night sky so that I can view it in all its glory and get a sense of wonder about the universe, 1 star. That wasn't a review, but it very well could have been. So there were just a lot of reviews that were tied to very specific features, and sometimes it was actually delved into my personal favorite, which is I call it the Ransom review. So an example is I will rate this app 1 star until Comic Sans is an option in the reader, a font option in the reader. And so for the people that want Comic Sans in the reader, I usually channel my internal Harrison Ford. We will not negotiate. Comic Sans is not an option in the reader. I apologize for that. However, that doesn't really help the problem in order to make the users happy. So we looked at these types of reviews, and there were some shared tones, too. The reviews are typically very passionate. So by that, I mean they were opinionated. Users had very strong thoughts on what the app should do, and often there was conflict in what we thought it should do and what the user thought it should do. So the reviews were also very polarized. I think the classic example is nobody graffitis Toy Story 2 is okay, right? There's always a very strong stance, and it might be positive, it might be negative, but rarely do you see someone invest the time and effort to post a review on the App Store that is just talking about how okay your app is. It's medium. So the other thing that we found out was that reviews are also very impersonal. They were the negative reviews. They were very much against the faceless entity of our company, or the faceless entity of the group of devs. These devs suck. Not so much Shaun is a horrible developer or something like that. So they were very impersonal. So the reviews were happening because someone wasn't listening to the users. Like I said before, the process was very reactive. Users would experience a problem, and the feedback happened in the App Store. They didn't tell us they had a problem. We had an area in the app where they could get a link to the support site where there was an option to email us or call us. And what we found out were that users don't typically like to email. How many of you have, just show of hands, have had a great experience and expect a great experience every time you email a company? Okay, yeah, it's usually a lost cause, especially the size of the company. Depending on the size of the company, it gets much worse. And then the other option was calling us, which I mean, me personally, when I call people, there's usually like I'm on fire, or it's like something very wrong has happened. So users weren't calling us either. So we were not meeting them where they were. They're in the app, and we were pushing them out someplace else. So we realized that we needed to be part of the feedback loop a lot earlier in the process, and we needed to be part of the feedback loop before or at the time of frustration, not after the review. So users didn't have a path to vent their frustration in the app, and so what we needed was a pressure release valve. And this is my favorite GIF, by the way. I could just watch that just over and over again. So, our solution. I was planning on giving a really quick demo, but the idea of doing a live demo terrified me. And I decided instead to just describe what we came up with in the app, because it's very simple in concept. So, users within the app would see a feedback tab that they could tap on, and inside that tab would just be a message-like interface where they could chat with us directly. They could post messages, post pictures, and you might have seen other apps that do this too. It's a common kind of pattern you see in various apps, and once those chats started happening, they would actually go to a Slack channel inside the Slack channel, there were other developers, there were engineers, there were managers, there were customer service people. There were just a lot of people. It was a very public channel. And someone would grab the conversation whenever it started, and that person would engage the user and talk to them and find out what the problem was. It was very empowering to developers to be able to talk directly to the user. And it was also a little risky for us because developers sometimes aren't the best people skills type people. So there was a little bit of training needed whenever people first started. And it was, O'Reilly has a very good culture of empathy. And so a lot of the people that we've brought in naturally kind of fell into that role. And it was a little risky, but we had people who were nervous about talking to customers and afterwards loved it, just having that feedback and to be able to chat with them directly. So what happened? There are a couple things that happened. The first thing was that we noticed that the chat is direct and one-to-one, and a lot of these things may seem very simple, but they weren't obvious. They're obvious in hindsight. They weren't obvious at the time. So the idea that chat is direct and one-to-one is obvious. You're chatting with someone directly. You're chatting with another human being, right? So that was something that it probably shouldn't have been a surprise that we discovered, but it was. We also discovered that users weren't talking to a faceless corporation anymore. They were talking to Shaun, the developer. They didn't know I was a horrible developer. It was great. This immediately normalized the conversation. And so it took it from a tone of, your app sucks to, oh, I see that there's someone working behind this app. I see a face. I see a human being. And that won a lot of ground in the conversation already. So users were also able to ask questions quickly or report bugs quickly, and we were able to respond quickly. It was very fast. We set the expectation that the replies might not be immediate because of business hours and just a lot of other things too. We typically, during business hours, would try to respond very quickly, which was disruptive sometimes, but it was worth it in the end. So it was fast, and it reduced the amount of time in the feedback cycle. So the other thing we learned is that chat is a happy place. Users feel validated because they're talking to an actual human being, and it shows them that we care. Just that seeing the little avatar and name beside someone's face when you're chatting with them shows them that, like I said before, there's an actual human being behind the company, and that people are building these apps, and it's not just a faceless company. So, a lot of that resulted in users who would not only report negative feedback, but they would also report positive feedback and feature suggestions, which is great. Which you love those kinds of reviews, right? Because that shows the users engaged in the product. We realized something else. So we were trying to solve for App Store reviews, but we were able to solve another problem. By giving users a place to show us or tell us what they wanted, we also gave them a place for us to figure out what they needed. So just because a user says they want something, it doesn't always mean that they need that. There's a difference between a want and a need. So as engineers and as product people, it is our job to take those wants and distill them down to actual needs. So I don't actually want a new video player in the app. Within our app, when it launched, the video player was very simple. It was a pause button and a done button, which if you've ever had to use a video player like that, it's not great. It's not a great experience. And so as users ourselves, we wanted to change it. Users complained a lot about it, and they complained loudly about it, and understandably too, because it was not the best experience in the world. So we as engineers wanted to fix it. Asking an engineer to fix something without data, though, is very dangerous. It is not a good thing. You can end up with some weird results, right? So what we decided is, I'll leave it on the Sims guy just stuck in the corridor. Is that not animating? Ah, it's disappointing. There you go. Yeah, he's jumping up and down. He can't get in that house. Okay, so so we learned that users didn't actually need a new video player per se. When we started engaging with users and talking to them, we found out that there were a couple of features that they actually really cared about. One was playback speed. The other was Chromecast and Apple TV support. Users wanted to be able to stream their content to the TV. We took that feedback and injected it into the product process, And when we launched the video player, those features were front and center of the marketing campaign and the actual launch, and users were very happy. We got a lot of positive feedback about it, and even because we had been chatting with users directly, we went back to some users who had spoken to us about it and complained about it and let them know a new feature had launched that solved their problems, and they felt very validated, and they felt like someone cared. It also reduced the amount of negative reviews in the App Store about the video player, and it gave users a chance to talk to us about other things that they cared about, and so it moved the conversation a lot further. So it was very important, and it took very little effort on our part to actually engage the user with it to get this data back. The other thing we learned is users don't want downloads deleted, and that might seem obvious, but given the cost of sometimes upgrading an app, having migrations fail, and having the app continually crash over and over again, or just delete some content, it's the lesser of two evils. For some users, though, this is a really major problem. Talking with users, we found out that users in other countries a lot of times don't have access to a lot of bandwidth and a lot of data. And so I actually spoke to an individual directly who lived in India, who he would travel into town and download a bunch of videos and content at an internet cafe and made kind of a day of it, and then would go back to where he lived, where he didn't have much internet, and watch his content offline. That was something that I had never really thought of before, a use case I had never really thought of, and I don't think I ever would have thought about that unless someone had pointed out to me or I had actually talked to the user about it. So we learned a lot about who our users are and how they think and what motivates them and what is important to them. So the other thing that we learned is it was great for triaging bugs. You have a real-time chat solution that you can actually work through a problem with a user, and if you allow engineers to do it, as we did, the engineers are the people working through the problems. So we had an issue again with the video player, and it was just one of those issues that you just want to tear your hair out because you can't solve the problem. We created dedicated Slack channels for this. We got a whole bunch of people in a room. We're actually distributed, so it was a hangout. We worked through problems with the content delivery network systems engineers trying to solve this video problem because videos weren't streaming properly. For some users in some countries, seemingly at random. It was impossible to reproduce. Until one day, we chatted with a user who happened to have this problem. And we worked through the problem with him and discovered, amazingly, that it was such a simple problem that we were expecting a Gregorian calendar, and he did not have a Gregorian calendar set on his phone. I don't think that that's something that I would have been able to solve once again on my own. And so having the user there gave us that moment of, no, that's it. Like, we can solve this. We know what the problem is. We can talk to them directly and work through it. It was nice being able to step through the code with the user. So I've talked a lot about really good things about this. There is a dark side of things. First off, users can be really mean. So you have to have a thick skin with all this, and you have to approach it from a place of empathy. I think that's a really important word, empathy, because it's important to remind the users that you're human, and it's important to remember the users are human too. There were sometimes personal comments that weren't constructive. There were frustrations being vented, and it was difficult to deal with that sometimes. One user in particular, there's something I remember where the user was really not happy and was venting their frustrations, and we had to remind the user this is a public channel. People can see you, and I think realizing that there were people watching them and seeing them helped once again to humanize the conversation. And it was fascinating because we took this user who was so angry at us and so frustrated, and afterwards they became one of our greatest beta testers and gave us tons of great feedback. And they went from this place of darkness to this place of lightness just with empathy and the chance to actually communicate directly with them. So another thing we ran into, and I don't really know, I couldn't think of the word to describe this, so I'll just say users can be gross. Sometimes when you have users of the opposite sex engaging with each other, they can mistake empathy for interest. And so that was something that was really hard to deal with because our employees their safety is very important, and we don't want to put people in an environment that feels uncomfortable. And so having the ability to block users is very important. We never had to do that, but it definitely is something to keep in mind if you are researching ways to engage your users and ways to actually chat with them. So the other thing we discovered, not that obvious, but users can be very, very loud. They're venting their frustrations. They feel very frustrated. And they can get very loud about some things. They can be very persistent, even chiming in every day, chiming in every hour just to try to get you to get something implemented. We also learn that users are not always right. And so you have to know how to say no, and you have to know when to move that conversation to another place and move it to that search for what they need instead of what they want. This often led to some really rich and interesting features that we wouldn't have thought of before. The Comic Sans user feature is not coming, though. In case you guys were all wondering, that's not coming. So the next thing, and this is really important. We had a designer on the team. His name was Ben Munson, and he actually, I think, distilled this down really well, and that's actually why I called this talk Storming the Castle. So in terms of framing the user and how they're feeling, here's what he said. Think of each person yelling from ground level up to a castle century high above. It's the voice of the powerless trying to change something. And I think that really encapsulates what we learned. This isn't a user yelling because they're a bad person. This isn't a user yelling or being negative because they don't like you. It's a user who feels frustrated and feels like they don't have a way to vent that frustration. So by providing that pressure relief valve, we were able to help users. So what did we learn? As O'Reilly, we learned what drives our users. Not only what drives our users, but kind of how they use the apps. When you get to talk to someone and talk about, day-to-day, how are you using this thing, what's going through your mind, you get to some interesting places. And it was really fun, engaging with some of the users and getting a chance to actually talk to them and enjoy everything they had to say about our apps. And another thing we learned is what matters to our users. So we learned that we can, the example of the India guy with the downloads being deleted. Just because something matters to us doesn't mean it matters to the user. And that was an important lesson for me personally as an engineer, because as an engineer, I often like to think I'm the smartest person in the room. I am not at AltConf for sure, but I am often rarely the smartest person in the room. And so it was a nice gut check to be reminded that there are people in the world who have a different perspective and have different needs, and those needs matter. And if they're your user, you should care about them, and you should care about how they're using your app. So the other thing we learned is how to advocate for the user. By talking to them and learning about who they are, where they come from, what they're doing, we've learned how to argue for them. There are times when we are in product meetings as engineers and as product folks, and we ask ourselves, would this particular user we talk to like this feature? Would it solve a problem for them? Would it help them out? Sometimes the answer is no, and sometimes we shelve it. Sometimes just asking that question answers some other questions about problems we might have faced or problems we might be trying to solve as we develop new features and add content to the apps. So one thing we learned, and I keep saying this, but I just want to be clear, users aren't always right. So the loudest voice in the room isn't always the correct one. That's very important to keep in mind, because sometimes that loud voice can be very overpowering and can dominate their conversation. So remember that your job as an engineer and as a product designer and as a manager or whatever is to ultimately help the user. And once again, a want does not equal a need. So the future. What does the future hold for O'Reilly with our in-app feedback? So I just stood up here and I talked to you about how amazing our in-app chat was. And if you were to download the app today, you would find out we actually removed it from our apps. There was a reason for this. And we have plans to bring it back. But I think we can utilize it in a more proactive way. So meeting the user where they are. So what that might mean is presenting the opportunity to chat with the user whenever they experience a bug. I'm just going to leave that up because I love this. I just watched this over and over again, and I felt my frustrations vent. But yeah, meeting a user where they are. So they experience an error in the app, and why not present a chat to help them and to work through the problem? You can utilize the opportunity to triage problems. There's a lot of great things that we want to do, and we're just getting started with this. So ultimately, what we're going to do is we're going to carry the lessons that we learned forward, and we know now who our users are, and we'll continue to advocate for them. And that is actually all. I talked a little fast. So I guess there's time for questions. If anyone has any questions, go ahead and raise your hand. And oh, yes, I think we have. Do we have a mic or not? Okay, just yell. Just like really yell. Uncomfortably loud. That's actually a really good question. So it varied. You could tell when we had done a release poorly because it was a larger percentage. What we learned was that often it was important to have engineers or to have customer service people ready to be on call at the time of release because we had a higher percentage of users. But typically it was around, anywhere from, it was very low. It was 1% or so, maybe I would say. Maybe sometimes higher, maybe up to 5, sometimes less than 1%. It depended on the day. But it became a job someone needed to do often because feedback kept rolling in. These were users, too, who were frustrated and who sometimes even had already placed a negative review in the App Store. And this was before you could reply to App Store reviews, and it's something that we've started doing, too, and engaging with users there. But it also gave us a great opportunity because we had a lot of users who, or not a lot, we had some users who would place a negative review on the App Store, and then we would talk to them and solve their problem. We could sometimes kind of tell it was the same user because they would ask for the same thing. And if we thought it might be, we would ask them to actually update that review, and a lot of times they did. They went and updated to 4 or 5 stars or something like that because we worked hard to solve their problem. Yeah. So I think it depends on how you frame it. Within the app, whenever you start a chat, we would auto-respond and say, hey, here are business hours. We will respond as quick as possible during those hours, but outside of those hours, just expect a response until the next day, which isn't the best thing a user wants to hear all the time, but it does help frame that conversation in a way so that if you aren't available, you don't have to suddenly, like if you are a small startup, you don't have to be online all the time and feel like you're always connected to your phone to respond to user chats. It sometimes backfired, as some things do. Users would still get frustrated that we weren't right available. But oftentimes we were available and could respond right away. There were times too that, if I was bored, I would go on Slack and check and see if any users had poked in and just respond to them. So I think framing it is important, so that way you don't, once again, let down your users again. If they know at the start that you're not going to respond immediately at what is your 2 in the morning, I think it's helpful. And also, we're a distributed company in a lot of ways. We have a lot of remote employees at O'Reilly. And so, and especially on my team, we have a lot of remote employees. And so we covered time zones pretty well, honestly. So we were lucky in that regard. I do think it would be a little more difficult as a single-person startup or just a small startup. Yeah.
How much of Slack did you have exposure to user? I mean, it sounds like on the back end you're using Slack, but what is the user seeing? Slack can be a little overpowering for a newbie like that.
Yes, it can sometimes. Yeah. There was nothing the user saw that would tell them that this was Slack. Why we use Slack is because we were, engaging users where they were, and we wanted to engage users where we were too, and we were in Slack. And so what a user would see was a messenger-like interface or iMessage interface or whatever you want to call it, WhatsApp, just chat bubbles basically. And there were slash commands available in our Slack instance that allowed us to respond directly to the user from there. There was contextual information about the user that was provided as far as, we didn't give out identifying information, but there was information as far as like, this is how, it was really relevant at the time how many items they might have in their queue, because there were problems with API endpoints as far as like timing out, and we were able to troubleshoot a whole host of issues just by knowing like, oh, this user has 2,000 items in their to-be read list. So there was a little bit of information to help us contextually in Slack, but the user had no idea it was going through Slack, except for, I think, a couple of times we accidentally put some emoji in, and there was a weird transfer where it would come off as the :name : to the user. So a little confusing there sometimes, but for the most part, users had no idea it was going through Slack. The other thing is, it actually could have went through other channels. That's just where we wanted it to go through. If you look at other products in the marketplace, there are a lot of options available for integrations. We also had things go through Salesforce, because that's where our customer service people were, and occasionally we would have things go through email too. But Slack was definitely the de facto place where everyone kind of congregated, so that's why we put it there. Any other questions? Yeah. We did not build a framework. I think that would, I have no desire to build a chat framework. I think that would be a little tough. We actually used a product called Smooch, which was really fun because then we get to say we're smooching our users, which led to some really interesting conversations with the kind of upper levels of management. But it's a really good product. There were just some, like I said before, some reasons why we migrated away from it. So yeah, I would recommend that, and there are a lot of other ones out there too that are really good. If anyone is developing a chat framework, apologies if I haven't mentioned it, and feel free to let me know about it, and I can mention it on Twitter. Oh, yeah. Yeah, so to be clear, Smooch is fine with GDPR. It was how we were using it. It was really more one of the times where we wanted to take a step back and change how we were doing it. And it was a good excuse in some ways to do that. And we decided that we did anonymize some things, and we went down that path, and we were already making sure we weren't collecting personal information, but there were just other ways I think we wanted to use this that we'd kind of outgrown the product, and so we decided it's probably a good time just to sever. And we didn't have anything ready on May 25th, and so that's why we had to remove it from the app. So it's very temporary, and it'll be coming back, but that is the reason why. Any other questions? No? All right. You guys have been a really great audience, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of AltConf. Definitely check out some other sessions. And I just want to say, as you are attendees, feel free to volunteer next year to speak. I was very nervous. This was very fun. I enjoyed standing up here and just talking to this very pointy microphone at my face. And it's not scary. Come up to it next year. It's a lot of fun. Yeah, that's all.